All right, so great to see each of you. My name's Jimerson, and I am the current editor-elect of School Psychology Review. It's great to be with you each today, and so many of you. We had over 200 colleagues pre-register for this particular SPR Zoom session focused on advancing social justice and school psychology publications. And so far, based on the poll, it looks like about 50% of the participants are faculty, and about a quarter are practitioners, and about a quarter are students. So that's the current group of participants. In terms of the extent of your knowledge that you're reporting as related to social justice, related to the field of school psychology, we see that about a quarter of participants have reported very extensive knowledge. About 65% have some knowledge, and then also 11% report limited knowledge, but eager to learn. So that's fantastic. And then to what degree do school psychology publications currently have an emphasis on social justice? In terms of those reporting very extensive emphasis evidence across publications, only 5%. Some emphasis in some publications, about 57%, almost 60%. And then regarding very limited emphasis evidenced across publications, it's at 38%. So it sounds about right. So for right now, I'll go ahead and end that poll, but wanted to give opportunity for us to get a sense of who's out there and what each of you are bringing to this discussion. And I'll go ahead and close that for right now, and then go ahead and should be able to advance here to the next slide. So I just want to highlight before we begin that many of you are following the School Psych Review Journal on social media. Also want to point out we have Jamie Flowers, one of our SPR social media team members, one of our leaders here with us, helping us today with this particular session. And we hope that if you're active on social media, such as Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, that you'll follow us and share information with us and help us do better within our School Psych Review social media efforts. Also, I just want to point out that School Psych Review's established a YouTube channel where we're featuring each of the videos that we've been doing each of the months. Last month, I think we did 3. This month, I believe we've got 2. And we plan to do special featured topics each month and then feature those on the School Psychology Review YouTube channel. So if you subscribe to that, you'll get notifications whenever we post new videos in there. And this particular session will be recorded and also featured in the School Psych Review YouTube channel. We're hoping this will be helpful to engage our community of scholars as well as students and practitioners. There's going to be lots of great information in addition to these types of Zoom sessions. We'll also be featuring 120-second summaries of science to bring that science to practice and inform policy as we invite authors of the manuscripts to post those types of videos as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and move forward. Hopefully we've got folks in now that wanted to join us today. And I have the distinct honor of being here with 2 colleagues who I've had such incredible admiration and respect for. Sherrie Proctor and Charles Barrett are here with us today. So thank you to each of you for joining us. And what I want to do is turn it over to each of you and allow yourself to introduce yourself, share a bit about your positions or experiences or whatever you'd like to highlight about yourself as we begin here today.
Yeah, so I guess I'll go. I'm Sherrie Proctor. I'm an associate professor of school psychology at Queens College, which is with the City University of New York. I am the current chair of the NASP Social Justice Committee, as well as the co-chair of the NASP Minority Scholarship. In terms of my research, I definitely consider myself a researcher who engages in social justice. I research issues related to diversity in school psychology. A lot of my early work and ongoing work has been focused on increasing racial diversity of our school psychology graduate student population. And most recently, my team and I have been exploring issues related to police violence in the practice of school psychology. And thanks for having me, Shane. Thanks for the invite.
Excellent, thanks.
I am Charles Barrett. I am a bona fide practitioner, ending year 12 in Loudoun County Public Schools, Northern Virginia. I also do some adjunct work in the school site programs at Howard and George Mason. And I can't forget my community college students that I also teach some undergrad psychology. NASP involvement, currently the MAC chair and a member of the social justice and pubs committees. A lot of my work focuses on equitable, socially just practices that lead to equitable outcomes for assessing culturally and linguistically diverse students. Most of my students that I serve in Loudoun are Spanish-speaking students, so looking at this is the process that we engage in to find the most appropriate, to make the most appropriate decisions educationally for them. Happy to be here today and engage in this discussion with Sherrie, my good friend. Thanks again for the opportunity, Shane. I was scrolling through the participant list and see a bunch of folks here that I know. So thanks for logging on and spending this time with us.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much, Sherrie and Charles. And like I said, it's just such an incredible honor to be with you both today as leaders, as scholars, as faculty, as practitioners. Each of you have been tremendously inspiring as well as informative in my sort of efforts over the past few decades. So I have great admiration for both of you. And for those that I haven't met, my name's Shane Jimerson, and as I mentioned, I'm the editor-elect for School Psychology Review. And then my, I guess, real job is to be a professor at the University of California here in Santa Barbara. And so again, enough about me. The important part today is that we're going to have an opportunity to engage in some discussion, hear some of the thoughts and reflections that both Sherrie and Charles have, as well as engaging in further sharing of information from participants. So we have some key questions that we've queued up, but then we also invite others to be able to share questions. Certainly the chat function works well. If there's anyone that doesn't want to post a question to all or feels like they'd rather just share it maybe with Jamie, Jamie Flowers, you can, I believe, share in the chat just privately, but you're welcome to post it for all as well. And also you'll have a chance where you can unmute your mic and you can speak up as well. So we're not just limiting you to the chat, but sometimes folks feel comfortable sharing information or asking questions that way. So feel free to do so. We'll pause on occasion to see if there's any more that we should go into on that particular element. And then we'd have preserved time at the end for questions and answers in particular, but don't hold back. Go ahead and get the questions flowing, statements flowing, and ideas flowing. In terms of our agenda today, during the next roughly 45 minutes, I'll briefly share the School Psych Review core commitments, as those do relate specifically to this topic today. Then we have some questions about social justice and school psychology. Again, both Sherrie and Charles have agreed to share some of their views and perspectives and information. And then we also have opportunities to further enhance, and we're wanting to look at your input, your ideas, as well as those that we've thought about. We'll have questions and answers also. So many of you know, as you've come to various sessions related to School Psychology Review, that we have 4 core commitments, the leadership team, myself included, as incoming editorial board, which we are starting to review manuscripts presently for the special topics section as of June. And as of July, we're responsible for all of the submissions except for the resubmissions that would be associated with the previous team. So as of July, we'll be managing all of the manuscripts for the next 5 years. And so we encourage you to contribute to School Psych Review. These are 4 of our core commitments. We have others, but here's 4 of the core commitments that we want to facilitate high quality and timely reviews. That's important. We also want to facilitate science informing practice and policy. As the NASP journal, it ought to really bring that science to inform practice as well as policy. I know this is really highly related to a lot of colleagues who are listed here who have joined us today. And then we're also aiming to increase distribution and impact. And as many of you know, School Psychology Review is now published in partnership between Taylor and Francis and the National Association of School Psychologists. This partnership is critically important for the dissemination and distribution of the content that's featured in School Psychology Review. both within the field of school psychology, but also really recognizing the importance of sharing this information with colleagues and allied professionals in other disciplines, and really featuring interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary scholarship. Then the fourth component, which is especially relevant to today's discussion, is our core commitment to the diversification, advancing the diversification of school psychology. And this is to contribute to the future of school psych review. This diversification within school psych review in terms of the scholarship, the leadership, and others will enhance our scholarship and our contributions tremendously, but also to the field of school psychology more broadly. So these are four of our core commitments that we aim to advance. I wanted to share that. And related to that, I wanted to take a moment simply to introduce the School Psych Review leadership team. Just in brief, this is important as related to our commitment to accomplishing those core elements. So we've got Frank Worrell, Tyler Renshaw, Sam Sung, Amanda Sullivan, Francis Huang, Jamelia Blake, Jorge Gonzalez, Gary Canave, Scott Graves, Dorothy Espalage, Stacy Ann January, as well as Purna Aurora and Shizin Huang. So it's important to highlight that I have the tremendous good fortune of collaborating with each of our colleagues to provide leadership for School Psych Review. And already I will point out, those of you who are interested in seeing some of the special topics that will be featured in School Psych Review just over the next year or so, you can already find that information on the NASP website. So I wanted to contextualize this and provide that information prior to taking a deep dive into the information that we're going to be focusing on today. And we invite each of you to join us, both as reviewers, as authors, as readers, and really try to enhance School Psych Review and ultimately all the journals in the field, or all the publications rather, in the field of school psychology. Okay, so we'll start here with this question in terms of going into the details for today's session. So the first question we had posted here is, what is social justice and how is it relevant to school psych training, research, and practice? And I know that both Sherrie and Charles have written about this topic, these topics extensively, really great experts to share a bit of information, their reflections on this particular question to sort of get us oriented and start the discussion.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll start. So first off, social justice isn't something new. It is something that is more prevalent in terms of discussions and articles and things like that for our field. Recently, NASP adopted social justice as one of its 5 strategic goals, which really made it a prominent concept for us to understand and to think about in terms of research practice and our training. So I just want to give you a little bit of background about how things kind of came about, and then I want to share with you the social justice definition that NASP has put forth to help school psychologists think about how it impacts our practice in particular. I believe it was about 2016, NASP developed a task force focused on social justice, and that task force did some wonderful work in terms of producing resources to help people think about race and privilege and things that we did a series, SP for SJ podcast series that you can go onto the NASP website and access to learn about the different ways we thought about social justice interacting with our practice as well as our research. And then I believe we were in New Orleans in 2016 when things were really moving along with NASP in terms of thinking about how prominent social justice should be to the work of school psychologists, but also to the organization of NASP as a structure itself. A group of experts, folks in the field who've been doing this work for a while, as well as NASP leaders, met together to kind of think about what should social justice look like for our field in terms of if we have to describe what is social justice to school psychologists. So after much deliberation and work and thought, we came up with a definition of social justice for the field of school psychology, which is included in our strategic goal plan. And this is the definition that we have adopted as a field. So social justice is both a process and a goal. And one of the things that we think is really important is to highlight this idea that it is a process. It's also a goal for our work, that we should see outcomes that are aligned with what we would think of as social justice outcomes. But really important is that it requires action. School psychologists work to ensure the protection of the educational rights, opportunities, and well-being of all children. So this next line is particularly important. And if I'm recalling things correctly, our colleague Sherrie, she's on here, she made sure that this language was in there, if I'm recalling our interactions correctly, when we're developing this definition. But this is very important. It ensures the well-being of all children, especially those whose voices have been muted, their identities obscured, or their needs ignored. Social justice requires promoting non-discriminatory practices and the empowerment of families and communities. School psychologists enact social justice through culturally responsive professional practice and advocacy to create schools, communities, and systems to ensure equity and fairness for all children and youth. And I'm just going to add to that, just to give you some more background around work that has been done in our field. So the leader, I would say, of researchers who've been doing work to kind of define social justice for our field has been David Schreiberg and his colleagues. Many of his colleagues have been students who've gone on to become practitioners and professors across the country. They have interviewed across the years experts in cultural diversity in school psychology, practitioners, as well as school psychology students to try to get their understanding of what they think social justice is and what does it mean to the field of school psychology. And across all the studies they've completed, some of the consistent themes that have emerged in terms of what we think as a field social justice is includes fairness, equity, advocacy, and cultural responsiveness. So Charles and I often have some interesting conversations about social justice as this distinction between social justice and equity, which I think often people think if they're doing work that's totally related to equity, that it is social justice work. So I think we could have a little conversation about that, Charles.
Sure. So I think that the definition is certainly a lot to unpack in that, but I'll just offer a couple more comments. So I look at socially just practices or social justice as really a process that we engage in these practices that lead to equitable outcomes. So it's how we approach doing the work of school psychology, but even before that, how we think about the work of school psychology. So it's how I engage students, how I engage families, how I frame student difficulty from a systems perspective first, and then that trickles down to, if necessary, there could be some, intra-student difficulty, but that should be a last resort coming from a socially just orientation. I also think about social justice like other schools of thought or approaches that we've been taught, in our grad program. So some of us could be behaviorists, some could be cognitive behaviorists, some could be humanistic, whatever, psychodynamic, whatever your orientation is. I look at social justice as another orientation to how you approach your work as a school psychologist. So if you are CBT or humanistic or psychodynamic, that framework really permeates how you intervene, how you interview, how you assess, all those activities that we engage in as school psychologists. Social justice is no different. So I can't just kind of sprinkle this condiment on to my work to make it more legitimate if it's not really baked into the process of how I understand my students. So I think of social justice as really an orientation, again, a framework, an approach that really comes out in our practices. And if we do that well, then we should lead to more equitable outcomes for all students. So whenever there is any type of inequity or maybe disproportionate outcome, could be for gifted ed, for suspension, expulsion, whatever that could be, I think that there is always a justice implication. And when we identify it and address that justice implication well, then we will ultimately address and eliminate the inequities that really permeate education and also school psychology. So I think all of those elements, the opportunity for the field, especially now, I think the climate is certainly primed for it more than it has been maybe in the past. I think the challenge for those of us who are practicing, those who are grad students, but also those who are training future school psychologists, be it internship supervisors or faculty, I think it's really infusing justice or social justice elements or concepts into everything that we do. Intervention, assessment, prevention, to really challenge students, and again, those of us who practice, to really think about these things critically, so that it really becomes one and the same with our work as school psychologists.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that, just in terms of practice, I think one of the most common questions that we get is like, how do you do social justice? Because it can feel very overwhelming, I think, when we just think about, okay, social justice practice, like, what does that even mean? How do we go about that? And one of the things Charles was describing was the importance of the outcome being equitable kind of treatment of individuals and equitable outcomes. But how do we go about getting to that process of going through that process of those outcomes? So one of the things we've been doing in the Social Justice Committee throughout this year has been trying to educate the membership as well as school psychologists at large about what social justice is, what it looks like in different arenas in terms of our work. And so I want to give you a very explicit example of what it can look like and how it can take place in practice. Celeste Malone and I wrote an article in the September 2019 issue of the Communique, and it's entitled Demystifying Social Justice for School Psychology Practice. I would implore you to go read the work that we've been putting out for the field, because it kind of lays things out for us in terms of a field, in terms of what social justice can look like in our practice. However, in that article, we talked about 3 different dimensions of social justice. The first dimension of social justice is the distributive dimension. And I'm going to use the example of gifted education and access to gifted education for particularly children of color. So when we think about the distributive dimension, we're thinking about how resources are allocated in society. And that's easily transferred to thinking about how are resources allocated within school systems, pre-K to 12. If I'm thinking about gifted education as a school psychologist, I'm thinking from a distributive perspective in terms of social justice, things like who gets access to gifted education. So I'm looking at demographics of which kids actually are getting access to gifted education. I may be looking at things like gender, race, SES. I may be looking at it from an intersectional perspective. Are Black boys getting access? Are students who are bilingual getting access? Is it mostly kids who are classified or would be coming from the upper SES? Are kids from low income and economic marginalization getting access? So that's the distributive, is thinking about how resources are allocated in your schools. The second dimension is procedural. That's the process through which decisions are made. So here as a school psychologist is your opportunity to ask questions like, how are we identifying students for gifted education? Are the measures we're using culturally fair? Are they relevant measures for the population? Are we using measures that are verbally loaded that may have some bias included in them? Are we getting referrals from teachers who may have implicit or even explicit biases in terms of who they identify to be tested for the gifted program? So procedural is just thinking about that process through which we're making decisions. And then the final dimension of social justice to think about in your work as a school psychologist is relational. So relational is really about how people are treated. Now, so we get kids in gifted education, right? And we have, say, some Black students in gifted education, which we know they're underrepresented, but we've looked at the distributive, we looked at the procedural, and we've made processes fair and equitable. So now we have those students in gifted education. How are they treated? Are they feeling discriminated against? Are they getting opportunities to contribute to the courses in terms of being called on, in terms of feeling included? Or are they having discriminatory experiences within that space now that they have had access to that space? So that's just a way to kind of think about going through this process of social justice practice. If you really are kind of confused about where to even begin, those are 3 kind of anchors to kind of think through where to begin and how to think about your practice as a school psychologist in the field.
Just one thought. When Sherrie was talking about that last point, I want to make a distinction here between diversity, inclusion, and equity. Again, terms that I know are thrown around a lot in the field, in education circles. So when Sherrie was talking about, so let's say we do increase the number of students who are identified for gifted ed, we increase, students of color. That's great. We have more diverse representation, but inclusion really takes that a step further and talks about their experiences or their meaningful involvement. So although I'm present, as far as diversity, am I really included or invited to engage in a way that's meaningful for me compared to other students who are also in that same situation? Then equity, for me in a lot of ways is also about power, but not only power, but shared power. So who is making decisions? Who is really invited or encouraged to speak up on behalf of certain issues or certain populations? So certainly, again, important terms, but I do think our vocabulary has to be very intentional. And when we say those words, that we know what we're talking about as far as the nuances between all those terms.
Yeah. I did want to talk a little bit about the research aspect because the social justice is also super important to our research and our training. It actually, social justice should be infused throughout our thinking about the way we do everything in school psychology, from training to research to practice. But in terms of research, I think it's really important because it changes the way we do research, the way we think about approaching research. It changes those folks whose voices are present in the research. I think about access, opportunity, and equity often when I think about research and social justice. So just to give you a definition, just so you can kind of understand how people are defining social justice research. Social justice research is the intentional use of inquiry to examine existing inequities or injustices and ways to overcome those. It really responds to existing social conditions. So if you really are thinking about, and going back to that definition that we put forth for NASP, thinking about whose voices have been muted, whose identities have been obscured, whose needs have been ignored. From a social justice framework in terms of research, we're thinking about all of those things, but we're also thinking very deeply about how do we engage communities? And then also how does our work translate into advocacy for those communities? And we'll talk a little bit more about more specifics about research, so I don't want to get too deep there, but I do think that in thinking about social justice, it isn't something that is just for practice, for practitioners. And then for those of us who are graduate educators, even thinking about the way we engage our students in school psychology graduate programs, because we know one thing for sure, and I definitely know from years of researching, is that we have underrepresentation of people of color in our school psych programs. And then when we have people of color in our school psych programs, many of them, particularly Black people, report experiences that are not inclusive, welcoming, supportive. So from even a social justice framework of thinking about access, opportunity, some of those things Charles was thinking about, inclusion, not just representation or diversity, using a social justice framework really does shape the way we engage with our students. Think about that relational perspective, the relational dimension of social justice. If you're a trainer who thinks about social justice, you're thinking about, how do my students feel in this program? How do all my students feel in this program? If there are certain students who have been historically marginalized, whether in society or in our school psych programs, how are we making those students feel included and valued and supported? So it really does, it's pervasive across and needed for every aspect of school psychology, whether you're a trainer, whether you're a student, whether you're a practitioner.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sherrie and Charles. That was really great foundational knowledge and information, and appreciate you touching upon each of the areas of school psychology that, as you have. and also really emphasizing the available literature that has been published both recently and over the past couple decades that would be relevant to provide a strong foundation for practitioners, students, faculty as we move forward, right? So the next question to discuss relates to where you were going, which is, how do you envision a social justice frame being infused into research and publications and such?
Okay, I will start, and Charles, you can shut me up. I love research.
Not at all.
Just say stop. Okay, so it starts with your research questions, okay? And so thinking about what are those research questions that have social significance, and going back to thinking about that definition of social justice research that I just gave you, how it is intentional use of inquiry to examine existing inequities and injustices and ways to overcome them. So, you know, whenever I start a study, the first thing I'm thinking about is the usefulness of it and the meaningfulness of it, and for what population am I trying to affect positive change? That's the first thing I'm thinking about. If my work isn't meaningful and useful, and it starts with your research questions, then I don't do the study. It's no point of me investing my energy, my time, my students' energy, their time into doing something that I don't feel is going to have some type of impact on the population that I would like to affect positive change for. So I think being super thoughtful as a researcher about, why are you doing this? Like, what is this all about? You know, whether you're a tenure track or you're starting your career, as a graduate student and you're thinking about your thesis or your dissertation, find a socially significant issue that will impact some population that would be meaningful in terms of their outcomes. And sometimes people think social justice research is just about, so like for instance, my team and I currently are doing we've just finished up a study on school psychologists who work in communities where a Black person has been killed, an unarmed Black person has been killed by police. So I think sometimes people think, okay, that's social justice research. Like it has to, but social justice research can be research that we traditionally have engaged in school psychology. It's just the lens through which you actually develop your research questions, contextualize your thinking about the issue, and how do you frame your discussion in terms of advocacy and next steps. And often, I think when we think about social justice research, we're thinking about impacting those systems that have traditionally been oppressive or marginalizing or discriminatory towards certain groups. So when I think of social justice research, if you're a researcher who does that type of research and you're thinking about, for instance, I'll give you an example. If you're looking at achievement and you're framing your work as social justice work, or you think, okay, I'm doing a study that is a social justice focused study, and you include race as like an independent variable, and you're looking at maybe like reading outcomes, or but you don't think about, you just think about race. So then at the end of your study, you've told us there's an achievement gap between Black and white students, right? That's not social justice work in terms of taking it to look at systems and oppression and how those things play out in terms of outcomes. So I would be looking for a study that would look at things like teachers' years of experience, because some of the things we know about schools for different racial groups is that kids who tend to be Black and Latinx, who are lower income, often go to school in communities where teachers have less experience, okay? That's all related to our racist systems of oppression that we've had in this country, right? If you think about, I would be thinking about things like, we know that property values actually support schools, right? So I would be thinking about, what does a kid's SES and the housing values in a community have to do with the resources that might be funneled into a school? I would be thinking about also things like racial fairness in the school from the kids' perspective. So we have a colleague, Sherrie Griffin, who does, her whole body of work is about racial fairness for African-American children, and how does that impact like their academic outcomes and how they feel about schooling. So I would be looking for things like that in an article that would purport to use a social justice framing, because it takes the focus off of race as what is the reason why we see these outcomes. And then we can have discussions about structural issues like school funding, right? Like teacher training, like teacher years of experience. And that gives us a natural way to talk about what do we really need in schools in order to create opportunity for all children. And so if you really think about the literature that you've actually been reading, probably, if you're reading literature that has a social justice framing, what we've been seeing the trend is that we've been moving away from talking about this racial achievement gap towards talking about an opportunity gap. And that opportunity gap is directly related to these structures that have been racist and oppressive in our society towards certain students and in our schools. And so now when you move away from that racial conversation, we're taking the focus off of an individual deficit model for groups of kids, and we're placing it on the structures. And that's where we can impact change. And so if we use our research to do that, and you have a natural path for having a discussion section or implication section that actually moves us away from that deficit model of looking at kids and deficits based on social constructions to real movement towards things that we can kind of impact as school psychologists through our work as researchers. So that's just an example of how I think about social justice research. Charles, I know you have something to say. I know you.
No, that was outstanding. I would echo that. I don't think, and I say this as a again a bona fide practitioner, but I don't think that we could engage in authentic social justice research without critiquing or interrogating systems. Because I think, as Sherrie said, when we don't do that, we unintentionally kind of succumb to deficit thinking that it's the child's race that led to the poor outcomes, knowing that race is a part of it, but the larger systemic structure is actually what we need to be focusing on. The only thing that I would add to Sherrie's brilliant response is thinking about who are you including in your literature. We all bring perspective to our work as individuals. So, and this is something that I'm just starting to really be more mindful of, even as I develop syllabi for my courses, is that am I including the voices and perspectives of historically marginalized, minoritized individuals who are also doing work around reading or assessment? That is huge. And I think a lot of the canon in school psychology are, white men or white women. So I do think being intentional about, I also want to include quality research from people who have not historically been valued or included. And to that, I would also extend the types of research that we value in the field. I came from really good program, Lehigh University, and very proud of my education there, but Lehigh had a very strong bent, like a lot of programs, towards quantitative only. Now that was a long time ago, maybe things have changed, but a lot of questions for social justice you can't answer with a T-score or rating scale. You need to talk to people and get perspective, and so interviews, qualitative methodology certainly I think is necessary to really move the field forward as we frame research for social justice.
I agree 100% with that, Charles.
Excellent. Excellent point.
We have a lot of questions.
Yes. Can I have them do the next one and then we'll circle back to questions? Does that sound good? Thank you, Jamie. Yeah, that was great, both Sherrie and Charles. And it kind of relates to the next question, which as I've seen some of the questions popping up, might have to do, a few of the questions have to do with this. What do you see as barriers to building a strong social justice research base in school psychology?
I'll go first. I definitely see one barrier is that I think that, I reflect on my own training, and And I think we do a lot of indoctrination of folks into school psych, which is what professions do. You want to think like a school psychologist. So we have these ways of training that are exclusive, and they're not expansive in terms of helping our students to bring other knowledge bases into their work and into their thinking. And so I've always thought about the need for school psychology to open up and be a bit more interdisciplinary in terms of making sure our students are able to access courses, like sociology courses would be a natural type of courses that would help students understand systems and structures and race and all kinds of isms that we experience in this country that are unique to this country and unique to how our educational systems are built. And I think that's missing in a lot of our school psych programs. I know as a graduate educator, I often get students who I'm trying to help them understand disparities, right? Educational disparities. And I'll talk about things like redlining or the GI Bill and how African Americans were excluded from getting mortgages, but white soldiers could get mortgages. They really, honestly, many of them, they have no clue about the history of structures that have been oppressive towards certain groups in this country. So they don't even understand how we got to where we are. And so we're training school psychologists who are going out in schools and they're seeing these disparities, and what we've told them are their racial disparities, right? So they're already coming into schools without the full knowledge, I think, that they need to be able to conceptualize how do we really change systems to impact kids who have been historically and currently marginalized in powerful ways, because they're lacking some of the knowledge base that I think is really needed. I think that's a weakness of our school psychology training, which actually translates to our research base, because we're not doing interdisciplinary work. We're not using theories, intersectionality theories, theories that critical race theory, critical theories. We're not bringing that work into school psychology, which I believe would make our research base, particularly our social justice research base, so much stronger, richer, deeper, more complex, more interesting, to be honest with you. And so I think that's one of the barriers.
I think that I think another barrier is that almost like we have this, and maybe it's changed again, in recent years, but we have this approach in school psychology that we have, one, maybe two courses on diversity or multiculturalism, or it's week 14, diversity issues in school psychology with course evaluations. Some of you are smiling because you've been there like I have. So I think it's really faculty infusing, again, these ideas of diversity and multiculturalism into whatever you teach, every class. So I'll give you a quick example. Started a class a couple weeks ago, and I felt that it would be insensitive, but also malpractice on my part if I didn't address police violence and racism in this country. That was not the focus of the course. It's an assessment course, but I could not pretend that in virtually every state there are significant events going on related to police violence and unarmed Black people in particular. So I think when professors use real life opportunities or examples as ways to connect their content to that, then I think students grow in their understanding of social justice. And I think that could be another way to develop a stronger research base, because they see it connected to assessment or to intervention or to consultation or other areas. And then I think that spurs questions for studies and dissertations. I think another one, I guess, maybe related to that is that, we go to programs to, study with people who have a certain expertise in a certain area. So whatever your interest is. And I just wonder that maybe there isn't a critical mass of professors who have an expertise around thinking about any issue or issues through a lens of social justice, and that could also be a limitation. So I think over time, as we really engage in this work, especially in our graduate programs, we should be building a generation of professors, of individuals who understand social justice, and that should lead to increased research, in our journals. I think the other thing I'll add, I keep ending, but I end with this last one, is I think having a home in the field for social justice research, as far as journals that are open to that, to publishing, methodologies that may not have been historically associated with school psychology. I think that's also important, that we're not going outside of the field to get our work published in other high quality journals. So I think there's a lot of opportunity on many fronts, from publications to grad training programs, also to grad faculty, and how we can increase our awareness in our skill set in these areas.
Yeah, I think, Charles, like a lot of what I hear you saying is just we have to build an infrastructure for this in school psychology, because if you don't have professors who, who are able to teach their graduate students how to do this type of work, then you don't have a new generation of professors going into doing this type of work. The other side of it, just from my experience as an associate editor at a journal, and also just as a researcher, is that there are not a lot of people who can evaluate and review the type of work, particularly if you're using qualitative methods as a way to kind of explore some social justice focused questions. And so there's so many barriers. I think there's biases. There are people who don't understand that qualitative studies typically have smaller ends than quantitative studies. I've had, my favorite thing to do is to do my a research talk on a study that I did about African-American school psychology program leavers. And it's a phenomenological study. And I love when professors ask me questions like, well, why didn't you include white people? I'm like, because it's a phenomenology about Black people. And so it's kind of interesting how, for me, we have this strong message of understand your methods and have tight methods, and all that holds true until you do work that's focused on Black people. Then all of a sudden we want to understand, like, why didn't you include Black people? Because that's not part of the methodology. And I understand my methodology. If you understand my methodology, you understand why I didn't include white people. And so, it's that kind of thinking in the field, and constantly having to challenge that type of thinking, even with our colleagues, that we say this is important. And so then when it comes to work that you don't value, or you don't necessarily think maybe should be in the field, you bring these different standards to it. And so no, the standards are the standards, right? So if we're teaching a new generation of school psychology students about qualitative methods, then that's what it is. Your population is intentional, and we value that, and we understand that that's part of the methodology that you're using. So we're not critiquing you on that. And you'd be surprised when you send your work out for review, some of the critiques you get when you're doing the type of work that is social justice focused, and the type of work that I do. It's part of it is misunderstanding, and part of it is just straight bias. So it's really interesting.
Excellent. Thank you, Sherrie and Charles. I think that did begin to address several of the questions that I was seeing pop up there. And you also started to talk about the next question, which is how might we address some of these barriers in our field? And I don't know if you have any other particular recommendations. I've already heard some in you sharing your previous comments, but I don't know if you have any other particular recommendations for publications. You had mentioned as associate editor or leaders or reviewers across the board. There's opportunities for all of us to contribute, but I don't know if there's certain ones that stand out that we might benefit in our publications to address these barriers.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think we have to have more diversity, and diversity in many different ways. Diversity of thought, diversity of experience, racial diversity. I think that people have to come to this field with differences, because I think that's how you develop people valuing difference. And so I think to the extent that we can diversify our field and have true inclusion in our field, where, for instance, if you're a professor and you don't do qualitative methods, but you have a graduate student who would like to explore a research question that would require qualitative methods, maybe it's more of an exploratory study, that you are open to supporting that student. And that might look like getting a committee together of people outside of the school psych program who have those experiences that they can help your student develop into the type of researcher that explores the type of questions that they find meaningful. I just don't think that we're at a place anymore where we can hold so tight to these ideas that we have about what is good research, large N studies, and you know, using huge data sets. And I think that we have some super important issues to address from a social justice perspective that we might not be able to get at using those methods. And we need to be open as a field to helping our students figure out ways they can address those types of questions, even if we don't have the skill set. And I think that might mean collaborating across disciplines with some other professors. I think that's an exciting direction that we could be headed in a field. To me, the possibilities are like endless for collaboration between school psychologists and other fields to build our social justice research. But I think it has to be an infrastructure building type situation.
Agreed.
Hey, can I add a comment?
Absolutely.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm sorry I was got on late and maybe this has already been discussed. I agree with everything that I've been listening to in the last 20 minutes. Something that I've been thinking a lot about is, you know, when I look at social justice research, articles, blogs, etc., I just feel like there's an overemphasis on the challenges and not enough on the achievements. You know, that, you know, Sherrie, you mentioned about the deficit model. I mean, clearly it's so much focus on the deficits that it's like there's no successes. You know, it seems like there's very little successes that is documented or consistently with people of color. You know, achievement, what happened with all that? You know, it's not like everybody's failing. Right. You know, what about some of the success stories and some of the structures that work? You know, we need to promote that, make that more prevalent and more evident to the rest of the country, the rest of the world, to say, look, you know, some stuff works, you know, so this does not replace, you know, what anything has been said. It's just that it's another area to add to the mix. You know, you've heard the old saying, right? There's for every complex problem, there's a simple solution, and there's usually wrong, you know. So there's so many things that could be done to work on the social justice topic, which is so broad. I would just like to see a little bit more on the achievement, on the positive aspects, you know, rather than always only on the challenges.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian. Yeah, and I know that both Sherrie and Charles have highlighted that as well as other scholars, but it'd be great to see even more of that work featured and such. I know we're going to just run out of time here, but I want to highlight that there's been lots of great comments in the chat, different colleagues sharing both questions, observations, and importantly, ideas. I did want to give Sherrie and Charles just a few minutes just to highlight that there is a NASP work group that's been formed to promote social justice in publications, and there'll be more information forthcoming, but I just wanted to give Sherrie and Charles an opportunity to share briefly on those efforts and what to anticipate on the future.
Yeah, so our work is just beginning, but one of the things I think we realize is that often people are really eager to do social justice work, but they don't necessarily know like how we had that conversation about framing and thinking about research questions and things like that. There may be some need to help provide the field with some guidance related to what might be some key features of a social justice focused publication, but also not just for our researchers, but also editors who may not necessarily completely understand this either, as well as reviewers. So I think I know we are collaborating with the publications, the NASP Publications Committee. So the NASP Social Justice Committee and the NASP Publications Committee are beginning a collaboration where we're going to create a few documents and resources that will help editors, reviewers, as well as researchers and authors in the field to develop social justice focused publications that are consistent with those key things that you know, we kind of see across other fields that have a really robust social justice research base. What does that research base look like? What are those things that we should be including in our pubs? So we're aiming to help the field, to really help make things a bit more explicit, so that when people want to engage this work, they feel like they have a place they can go to for resources in order to be able to do really good social justice work for this field.
Thank you, Sherrie. Thank you, Sherrie. Anything you wanted to add to that, Charles?
No, sir. Sherrie covered it all.
All right. Well, again, with our best hope that there may be opportunities for even more questions, suggestions, insights. I know a lot of folks have put them in the chat, but I know that we're just about out of time as well. I just want to express extensive gratitude for both Sherrie and Charles taking time yet again today to be able to share this important information with us. I believe that this is just one conversation of many that are going to be ongoing, that are essential to keep the momentum and to keep focusing on the actions that each of us can take. And so I wanted to highlight that here, but I know that we're just about out of time in terms of what our speakers had committed to, and as well as colleagues attending and such. So I do want to express immense gratitude to both Sherrie as well as Charles, and highlight that this is not the end. This is just the end of our Zoom session today. But everything that each of you talked about in terms of the importance of all of us as faculty, as practitioners, as students, there's an opportunity, interdisciplinary collaborations, the many things that I was hearing each of you highlight today, so critically important. And then that we bring that information back to our efforts and our daily actions. And for some of us, that's serving as reviewers on editorial boards, or serving as action editors or editors of journals. But across the board, publications writ large, from Communique and the School Psychologist to School Psych Quarterly and School Psych Review and Journal of School Psych and all the other journals out there. Really attending to this information in a meaningful way, and intentionally and purposefully aiming to enhance and improve and make things better. Sorry about that, the light goes off, but it's been really great. I know a lot of folks have shared comments there. Charles has indicated you can email him as well. He's very generous with his time. And both Sherrie and Charles have always been incredibly forthcoming, incredibly generous. So I want to appreciate that. And I don't know that it'll allow me to send a clap to each of you, but I can say that greatly appreciated. And I look forward to further communications, collaborations. Again, sorry we didn't have an opportunity to engage in further discussion today, but perhaps we could continue a discussion even in July and bring folks back together and engage in even more questions and answers and that sort of thing. Perhaps Charles and Sherrie or other colleagues who would also like to contribute to these discussions, and importantly, ongoing actions, because it's going to take more than just talking about this. It's going to take those actions that we're going to engage in individually as well as collectively. So thank you. Thank you so much for everyone attending today. And thank you to Sherrie and Charles. Greatly appreciated.
Thank you, colleagues, for joining us. Thank you, Shane, for the opportunity.